So this morning I want to read to you from Exodus chapter 20, and what I'm going to go over a little bit is the first 4 of the 10 Commandments. Exodus chapter 20, starting in verse 1, this is from the King James Version. And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. In the first 4 commandments, God tells us 4 things about us relating to Him. The first one, verses 1 through 3, who should we worship? And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. The children of Israel were headed for the land of Canaan, but the promised land was populated by a pagan people who had a God to solve every problem they had. God knew that it would be easy for his people to be seduced by these physically, earthly representations of Canaanite deities and the depraved worship that accompanied these idols. He did not want to see the people whom he had delivered simply enslave themselves again. For us today, we think of idols, we think of someone worshiping a fat, smiling Buddha, or a woman in Nepal worshiping at the image of Kali, a bloodthirsty Hindu goddess. Today, we are actually in little danger of worshiping an idol that is made out of gold or stone. But sociologists tell us that something is a god, it is an object of worship when it becomes our source of self-worth and the ultimate consideration in our decision-making. We can put only one thing in the top slot of our priority system. Whatever is in that position dominates everything else in your life. God is the only one who deserves the number 1 position in your life. He deserves first place, not only by right of creation, he created you, but by right of redemption, he sent his son Jesus to die for our sins. So how can we make God first in our lives? Number 1, we have to stop to worship. We have to remember the awesome God who has condescended to have a relationship with you. Reflect for a moment on the fact that the God of the universe wants to have fellowship with you. Wonder cultivates worship. Remember what God has done. It is easy in our day and age to forget just where we would be but for the grace of God. Look for the things that you have to be thankful for. There are so many of them. Number 3, recognize the competition. If you stop to evaluate your life for just a moment, it will reveal what we consider important. If we tell people that things are not important and that God is, and then we live our lives as if the opposite is true, what is it that we are really telling other people? Next, we look at how should we worship. Verses 4 through 6. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, to the 3rd and 4th generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. It is not the worship of false gods that is condemned here. Otherwise, this would simply be a repeat of the first commandment. Rather, this commandment refers to the inadequate and inaccurate image of the true God and their use in worship. It is possible to worship false gods, but it is also possible to worship the true God falsely. While Moses is on the mount receiving these 10 commandments, the people who had grown weary in waiting for Moses to come down off the mount turned to Aaron and said, according to Exodus 32:1, "Come, make us gods that shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." So Aaron gathered the gold, melted it down, and made a statue of a calf. Then he said, this is in verse 4, then they said, "This is our God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." But don't be confused. It wasn't that they wanted to worship a different God. They just wanted to worship their God in a different form. They would have been horrified if they thought that someone meant they were going to worship another God besides Jehovah. They just wanted to worship God in their way, in the form of this calf. There's an old story about a man who was walking along a steep cliff. One day he fell accidentally because he got too close to the edge. As he slid down the cliff, he reached out and he grabbed a hold of a branch that was sticking out, and he hung on for dear life. He looked below him and saw the chasm stretching down hundreds of feet. He looked up and he saw no footholds with which he could climb back up. So he hung there, absolutely terrified, and he began to yell for help. "Help! Help! Is anyone up there? Help!" He heard his own voice echo for hours, but nobody responded. Then finally he heard a voice. "Jack! Jack! Can you hear me?" Jack was thrilled and his heart swelled with hope. "Yes, I can hear you. I'm down here clinging to this branch. I can see you, Jack. Are you all right?" "Yes, but who are you? Where are you? I can't see you." "It's God, Jack." "I'm everywhere," was the answer. "What?" Jack said. "You mean the God?" "Yes, Jack, that's me." "Okay, well, Lord, please help me out here. I promise that if you get me out of this one, I'll never sin again." Anybody ever said that? "I promise, Lord, if you get me out of this one, I'll never sin again. I'll be the nicest person in the whole world. I'll go be a missionary in Africa or something. Just get me out of here." Hey, take it easy on the promises, Jack, said the Lord. Let me get you out of there, and then we can have a long talk. Now, here's what I want you to do, Jack. Listen to me carefully. Jack shouted excitedly, I'll do anything you say. Just tell me what to do. Okay, Jack, said God. Let go of the branch. There was a long pause. What? I said, let go of the branch, Jack. Trust me. Just let it go. Another long pause, and Jack said, is there somebody else up there that could give me a hand and help me out? And that's how so many of us respond to God. We want Him, but we want Him on our terms. Something is missing in the worship of most Christians in America. It's not often that churchgoers even contemplate finding themselves face to face with a living God. If there were, there would be a renewed recognition of His holiness. Unfortunately, it is all too easy to acquire a vast storehouse of fascinating information about God without coming face to face with Him. We can know all about God theoretically without really knowing Him personally. An encounter with a living God shakes us awake, arrests our attention from all the things of that make up life. Family problems, sales meetings, sporting events, and our own self-pity. It awakens us to the greatness of the person we are meeting and the sheer grace it takes to allow us into His holy presence. It interrupts our plans. It changes our priorities. It confronts with God's claim on our lives. It is not something that we can turn away from and forget about on the way home. Pastor Warren Wiersbe once said that we have lost all contact with who God is. He says, rather than an encounter with a living God, we are toying with an image of our own imagination. The second commandment addresses this desire to fashion a God of our own design. The God we fashion in our minds is convenient, but not very compelling. What else would explain how a person could stand and sing in church without missing a note, and at the same time be plotting their strategy for work the next day? How can one sit through a sermon looking attentive, but inside thinking only of the first 15 minutes of that football game that they're missing? How can a family who to the world appears to be perfect hear the message but never apply the truth they know? These people would say that they are worshiping, but what message are they conveying to their children? That is where verses 5 and 6 come to play. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. A name symbolizes a person. So when we use someone's name in an offensive way, we naturally are offensive to the person whose name it is. For example, you might find it personally offensive that people refer to the restroom as a John. If your name is Fred or Bill, that may not bother you. But if your name is John, that might not be the way what you want people to call the bathroom. The two principal areas in which we can apply this commandment in our lives today are our words and our walk. First, let's look at our words. In other places in Scripture, this is explained that we are not to profane the name of your God, Leviticus 18:21. Our English word profane comes from two Latin words, pro and phantom. Pro means in front of, and phantom means temple. So simply put, profane is a word or words that you would not say in church. Almost everyone understands that the third commandment prohibits the using of the Lord's name as a cuss word. Some do not seem to realize that this applies to the slight alterations that have been made by those who wish to abide by the letter of the law, if not its spiritual implications. We use words like dadgummit, gosh darn it, good gravy. I've told you guys before, if you're in the South and someone says bless your heart, that's not a good thing. You're being cussed. It just sounds pleasant. All of these are still variations or violations of the third commandment. Secondly, this commandment applies to our daily walk. Cleaning up your language is only a minor part of complying with this commandment. The verse says that we are not to take the name of the Lord your God in vain. The word vain is an old English word that means empty, useless, or for worthless purpose. As Christians, we bear the name of Jesus, and we are called by his name. We must live for him lives which glorify his name. This means we are prohibited from a casual approach to God's person symbolized by his name. And we are not to seek to use the power of God for our own personal gain. As we talked about last week, you guys have learned at this point that I love history. One of my favorite stories about Alexander the Great. Alexander was a brilliant strategist and mighty conqueror. He was not only a leader of men, but he was fearless in battle. Oftentimes, he would charge forth, leading the men himself, riding his horse, and he would hurl himself headlong into these battles and be standing there when everyone else had fallen. He was a courageous man. There was not a cowardly bone in his body. He conquered the known world of his day, and it is said of him that he wept when there were no more lands to conquer. The story is told of him sitting in judgment on the battlefield. There he was the judge and the jury. His word was law. When he had spoken, it would be done. There on the battlefield, he would take his seat, flanked on either side by his trusted officers, and before him would be brought all of those with charges against them. Many times his judgment would be extremely harsh, especially in the situations of desertion. Before him one day they brought a young man. He was a fair-haired youth, very young. Alexander asked what this young man's name was, and the officer presenting him said, "Alexander, sir." At once the great general's countenance softened. It was as if he was flattered that this young man had his name. His men breathed a sigh of relief. Perhaps there would be some leniency for this young man, whatever his crime. Alexander inquired as to the nature of the charge against the young man. His officer replied, "Cowardice, sir. He fled in the heat of battle." The once soft countenance of the great general was suddenly transformed into an intense, tight-jawed grimace. Looking the boy squarely in the eye, he said to him deliberately, "Son, what did you say your name was?" And the boy said, Well, it's Alexander, sir." Speaking again to the boy, this time in a louder tone, he said, "Young man, what did you say your name was?" The young man answered in a stutter, It's Alexander, sir." To that answer, the emperor bolted off of his throne, grabbed the terrified young soldier, and said to him, "Young man, change your behavior or change your name." Might the Lord be saying to us, Christian, change your behavior or change your name. Next, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. This must be a very important principle. I want you to notice that God said more about the fourth commandment than that any of the other 9 that we will go through. God uses only 4 words for telling man not to kill. You shall not kill. But here he used 94 words for telling man that it is necessary to keep a day of rest. That should help us to understand that the fourth commandment is very important. I would like to suggest 3 simple things that you can do that will add meaning to your life. Number 1, make Sunday a day of rest. Many seem to take it for granted that the fourth commandment is all about worship. That to keep the Sabbath was to worship, which meant going to church. But in reality, the subject of this commandment is not worship, but about work and leisure, their place in God's plan, and keeping them in proper balance. Literally, the Hebrew Sabbath means rest, and keeping the Sabbath is about balancing work and rest. Even though Christians are not bound by the law, the principles of work and rest and leisure still need to be applied to our lives. The text tells us in verse 11 that the principle of the Sabbath is rooted in creation, just as in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day, so must we. Number 2, do all your work as unto God. What is necessary to apply this in our lives today is to realize we need to reclaim a biblical understanding of work, to recognize that our daily work falls into God's jurisdiction just as much as the pastor's work. Paul reminds believers of some very important truths in his letter to the Colossians, chapter 3, verses 22 through 24, where he says, "Bondservants, obey in all things your master according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. And whatever you do, do it heartily, as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ." Paul is saying that we go to work for the same reasons that we go to church, as an act of worship. We have the really misguided notion that the only work for God that counts is by going into the full-time ministry. A story I recently read about William Wilberforce really helped me to see this more clearly. Think what would have happened if William Wilberforce, the man credited for almost single-handedly stopping the British slave trade, had left politics for the ministry. When Wilberforce made a serious commitment to Christ, he went to John Newton, writer of Amazing Grace, to discuss whether he should leave Parliament and enroll in seminary. Newton, a pastor, wisely reminded Wilberforce, "Maybe God has you there for a purpose." Because Wilberforce remained in his secular calling, he not only became one of the strongest forces for Christ in his generation, but slavery was ended in the British Empire, largely because of his personal crusade, something that would have been impossible from the pulpit. Number 3, make Sunday a day for corporate worship in church. God not only wants us to stop working, He wants us to start worshiping. Just as our bodies need rest, our spirits need worship. That does not mean we can't worship outside of the church building, because we can. But there is something uniquely refreshing and dynamic about coming together for worship as a body. We are not to neglect this time of corporate worship. The writer of Hebrews commands, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, Hebrews 10:25. There may be emergencies and other situations that cause you to miss the gathering of the church, but those should be the exceptions and not the rule. Billy Graham once said, Jesus spoke about the ox in the ditch on the Sabbath. But if your ox gets in the ditch on every Sabbath, you should either get rid of the ox or fill the ditch. The application is, we need to give God the number one place. Anything else is unacceptable. Whatever is the source of your self-worth, the ultimate consideration in our decision making is our God. We must beware in both our words and our walk that we do not carry His name in an empty way. Some of us really may need to change our ways or change our name. And remember that God has designed only one day in 7 as a day of rest and worship. Make a commitment to be faithful to the Lord's house on that one day. You guys, I thank you for listening to me this morning.